So I'm going to give really, we've had a couple of designers' views there. My name's Charlie Law. I've spent around 30 years in the construction industry, the last 15 of which have been spent looking at waste and resources for lots of construction companies such as BAM, Lend-Lease and Kia recently. As far as the amount of resources we use in the construction industry, 400 million tonnes of resources we use each year in the construction industry. And we all know the big problem. We are a take, make and dispose industry, linear industry, which is something we need to get away from. As far as the current model, these are some of the figures that we have. It's estimated, and no one really knows the exact figure, it's estimated we generated 49 million tonnes of C&D waste. So that excludes your excavation waste, which is a resource in itself, but just the C&D waste is 49 million tonnes. Now of that, actually, only 3.7 million tonnes was actually landfilled. So we are actually pretty good at diverting waste away from landfill. And you can see where it all goes there. The problem is that when you start looking at that materials recycling facility and where their waste goes, where they send that material to, up to half of that is probably going into energy recovery. The figures aren't really there. It's difficult to find. But say around 11 million tonnes is going into energy recovery, of which 3 million tonnes of that in 2015 was actually exported, mainly to Europe, mainland Europe. So, you know, we spent a lot of time manufacturing these high-value resources, putting a lot of energy into them, and actually most of that either ends up getting burnt, or the rest of it, this reused element, is a lot of cheap fuel that goes into the ground in a lot of cases. And there's not enough coming back into high-value materials production. So what should this look like? And this is the circular economy model, and this is my interpretation. You'll see many of these different circles as you go around. This is my interpretation of it. We've got our raw materials coming in. We need to design out some of the fossil fuels, restrict our finite materials, and try and use as many renewable resources as possible. We should be having energy efficient production, renewable energy, and any waste from that cycle needs to be coming back into that production loop. So that's the manufacturers, that's their responsibility, and they're doing a pretty good job of some of this. You know, they are moving towards this pretty well. The in-use phase then is we've got our installed product. We need some way of maintaining that product in that loop. And this is where Richard and Duncan were coming from. It's business models is where a lot of this lies. So it's things like service contracts and lease agreements that we need to try and get in place and make good maintenance regimes to make sure those materials last for their intended service life. And then we've got our return cycle, which is where one of the biggest issues we've got is how do we get that material back, disassemble it for refurbishment, reuse, refurbishment and recycling. So where are the current issues? I think these are the current sticking points in my mind. The service contracts at the moment, sale is still the main option. Maintenance and repair, we don't always make it easy to get to stuff to maintain it or repair it or swap it out. We don't design buildings for disassembly, as Duncan's been saying there at the moment. And as I said before, recycling is the default. We haven't got much reuse or refurbishment going on. So what can we do? So first of all, let's have a look at how we can maintain products in use for as long as possible for their service life. So this is, you know, if you've heard of the 6 S's, the 6 sections of a building, we've got our site, which is eternal. Our structures, anything from 30 to 120 years plus, depending on the type of building. If we take a typical office block, is what I'm going to be looking at as our main focus here, which is the sort of building that does get changed around quite a bit, demolished, updated, more so than, say, housing. So we've got our structure, which might last at different times. We've got a skin on the outside of that can last anything between 20 and 60 years. Services, 15 to 30 years. Space planning, so our internal partitions, ceilings, etc., 5 to 15 years, depending on that. And then we've got our stuff, our furniture, our cabinets and everything else, which could be as little as 5 years, probably maybe 10, maybe a bit longer than that. And you'll see in some of this that there could be a lot of mismatch in that, and what we generally end up with is, you know, we're refurbishing a building after 10 years, but then we need to swap out some services after 15 and demolish half of the space plan to get to those services. So, you know, that's not good planning, and we need to make that better. And I talk about some of this stuff, you know, the stuff as fashion items. So we don't need to design them for long-term use. They can't last forever because our fashions change, our tastes change. We don't want, you know, carpets that have got all flowers over them now that we may have had 20 years ago. So our fashions change, so we need to design stuff to make it easily recyclable. So just, you know, if we can, let's try and optimise and get to the far end of those as best we can, but we've got to remember that fashion item. Also, look at how we've tried to make sure that the services and the space planning try and align. So if we take some examples of this, we've got our service life along the bottom here. You can't quite see, say 10 to 120 years. We're going to have carpets. They're very much our fashion item. They're not going to last much more than 10 years. So we need to make sure that they are, we can extend them in some ways. So we might use a different type of flooring, say a ceramic tile or a timber flooring, which might last a bit longer. That's extending that service life and getting more value out of that material. If we do, we are going to use carpets, but we need to make sure they are recyclable and easily recyclable after that 10 years. We take our space planning. We're very much wedded to plasterboard and stud in this country, and it never gets recycled as much as it should do. It's a big issue. So we need to make sure we got that. So we need to make sure that we get into relocatable partitions. Services need to make sure that they are interchangeable, adaptable, and modular construction. And in our cladding systems, to see if we can extend those life by using modified techniques and make sure our frames are flexible. As far as some of these modifications, these are some examples of timber modifications, thermal and acetylate treated timbers, for example. These are good insulation, will last for up to 60 years, some of those. And in designing for deconstruction and disassembly, we need to, you know, click fit options for removing components so they can be serviced, easily erecting and dismantling of frames, for example, and screw-type fittings for products and components. And when you start to add these in to our business model and add our maintenance regimes, you can see there where we start to see where service contracts and lease agreements that we were talking about earlier on could come in, possibly with some sort of maintenance contracts as well. And then we need to have our return logistics. We need to have these materials passports that are probably built into a BIM model in most cases that tell you what to do with that product at the end of its life. And it's this logistics model that one of the other issues that we need to sort out. We need to work with our existing logistics providers, whether that's backhauls or waste companies, to make that cost effective going forward. Just some examples of the ones that are some of my favourites. Part 2020, designed. The developer has maintained ownership of all the materials there, so you can reuse them. Boomen Town Hall, designed for a 15-year life, although it may need to last 40 years. They don't know, depends on the makeup of that government. But all this building is designed for to be dismantled and moved somewhere else. And probably my favourite around the building, Leander in the Netherlands, again from Turn 2, both of these last two from Turn 2. If we can design a building like that can be turned into that, using all the existing buildings by doing things like pre-demolition audits, that's what we should be doing to maintain buildings, not constructing new. So my three key recommendations, just to end there: design flexible spaces to optimise service life for the products, design products for disassembly, manufacture and reuse, and implement these business models to aid recovery. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to John now for his presentation.